It doesn't happen often that a case manufacturer releases a relatively affordable case that in some way ends up being kick-ass for us consumers. So today I'm going to take a look at a bit of a secret tip, or rather, insider's tip if you will. Let me introduce you the Sharkoon TG6 RGB. Some of you probably already heard of it. Currently it costs between 85 to 95 US dollars, but it appears it isn't available yet at any of the major US retailers. In Europe, however, it's widely available. We are getting a design here with lots of emphasis on RGB lighting, one could say, and for the price this thing is offering pretty good features. What exactly makes this case special and what things you have to look out for, you'll find out in today's video. Because the TG6 RGB does in fact have some downsides too. Once you know of those, however, you could build a really cool system into this case. So you've heard it, this by far is no perfection, which honestly at $85 simply can't be expected whatsoever. Right away, I can point out the most obvious of things. With today's case, RGB lighting seems to be of a fairly high priority, ARGB to be exact, meaning the manufacturer did have to skimp on a few functional features to make room for the fancy modern bling-bling gimmicks, basically a budget reason. This of course also means that Sharkoon with their TG6 RGB mainly targets this case towards the die-hard RGB following. What's new here is that modular frame design of Sharkoon's own RGB shark lights fans. The special thing about those is that the screws are no longer visible. Also, it's quite obvious the manufacturer did not skimp on lighting. On the left as well as in the front we get nice tempered glass panels. What bothers me cosmetically though is the left panel, which does overlap slightly in terms of general case width, but then again it's not a big deal. Airflow we do get with the TG6 RGB, albeit such a solution with relatively little room to breathe behind the front glass panel is never ideal. We know that, but as long as you don't install a super duper overkill high-end system into this case, it's fine. After all, there is some intake happening through those vents in the front. At a price of roughly $85, Sharkoon doesn't simply impress with just one or two, but a total of 4 120mm fans, and all of them feature addressable RGB lighting. On top of that, we aren't talking of those pesky proprietary connections, but in fact proper standard 3-pin 5V connectors, which almost all new modern motherboards offer a header for. But that's not even all, there's even a ARGB controller integrated with 4 more 3-pin connections for more extension. Colors and effects can therefore either be changed via the reset button, or you could just hook up the entire controller to your motherboard. That's actually very impressive at a price of $85. I haven't seen that yet in this price range. However, it also comes at a price, the lack of a fan controller or fan hub. So that's where the manufacturer got a little creative and just connected the 3 front fans together via Molex. This obviously means the fans are spinning at their max fan speed. In this case, it's 1000 RPM if I'm not mistaken. So I wouldn't necessarily speak of high noise levels here, but this solution isn't the quietest either. This is where I would have welcomed Sharkoon to include some sort of fan splitter, so we could easily connect the 4 fans to our motherboard in a nice clean way. If we briefly look over the specs, there's not really much that's out of the ordinary here. It's just that some questions start to arise. For instance, how's the radiator support in this case? Well, in the front you could fit up to a 360mm one, that certainly ain't bad. For the top, according to the specs of the manufacturer, there's no official support for any radiators. Okay, you might have noticed the height of our motherboard's heatsinks could end up causing clearance issues. This, however, easily could have been fixed by either adjusting the general case height or by moving the screw holes for fans and radiators slightly away from the center. That's how other manufacturers such as Fractal Design, for instance, deal with this type of issue. Other than that, my test system fits almost perfectly into today's TG6 RGB. Long graphics cards are of no concern here either, although I have to point out there's no option to mount a GPU vertically in here, but that really doesn't bother me. What's a little more interesting though is the hard drive situation going on here. 2 HDD trays for 3.5-inch drives is what we're getting, the installation all toolless. And as an emergency solution, you could even fit a third hard drive below the hard drive cage on the case bottom. In order to do so, you have to remove that plastic cover though. If you want to be even more creative than that, there's even the option given to install a fan into the first tray slot instead of a drive. Alternatively, you could remove the hard drive cage altogether or move that one horizontally in order to make room for longer power supplies. For 2.5-inch SSDs, we get 2 trays directly on the PSU shroud, but in theory, altogether, there are dedicated mounting points for up to 4 of such drives. On the back of the case, after all, there's some more room for 2.5-inch drives, but then again, we are only getting 2 of such trays anyway. Now, in order for this system not to end up in a pile of dust, on the front panel there are vents with removable dust filters. On the bottom, there's one of those cheap ones for the PSU, and on the top, a nice magnetic dust filter. Some of you surely have noticed Sharkoon decides to skip rubber grommets. Instead, we get cutouts at pretty much the ideal spots, so cosmetically speaking, we don't lose much as opposed to rubber grommets. And cable management, well, now we're at the topic. This is where I most of the time do a fairly sloppy job due to being way too impatient and not necessarily too skilled in that department. While this case sure doesn't offer the best options for cable management, it needs to be said, if you put some more effort into it than I did, you can achieve some great results nonetheless. Also, you may have noticed by now that I have abandoned my ketchup and mustard power supply with way too many cables. Matching with today's case, I've instead decided to go for a fully modular one by Sharkoon. This is the Silent Storm Cool Zero 650 watt, in case anyone's interested. And yeah, what else can there really be said about the TG6 RGB? For $85, we certainly do get a pretty good feature set, so to speak. In some aspects, such as fan control and top radiator support, there needed to be made some compromises, but for those of you that tend to care a lot about aesthetics at a relatively affordable price, this case is a good choice, especially since we're getting a proper, decent ARGB controller with extension possibilities already integrated. These, of course, are things not everyone might necessarily be into, but a lot of you guys in this community happen to want exactly something like this. And this is the reason why I'm giving the Sharkoon TG6 RGB my Gold Award. And yeah, that's pretty much it from my part. Happy New Year from me, hopefully a great start to a new decade. Hope you're all well, stay healthy, get well.